Well, what to say on my last 3 Sundays? As pastors transition, we're all mindful of what are you going to say in those last few weeks you have at a church, and mindful of what are you going to say in the first few weeks at a new church. And so that's something that's obviously been on my mind for a little while, trying to figure out what to say. And this is a little bit unusual for me, because of unusual circumstances. This is the only time I've ever been at a church for 1 year. I've been at a place as long as 14 years. And so that's a different kind of thing than it is having been at a church for a brief time. And so as I thought through it, I thought, well, in some ways, because of all the reasons that there are, I've not had a chance to really reflect a whole lot on what I see here. You know, the thing is that there are some folks in a church that have been members of a church for a very, very, very long time. And I know some of you have been members of this church your entire life. And so you have that experience, right? And so one of the things about going from different places is you come in with new eyes. You see things that others may not see. You see things differently than some people might see them. And so I thought this was an opportunity just for me to reflect on some things for these 3 weeks of things I've seen and try to bring a message of hope going forward. And what does that look like? So that's my effort in these 3 weeks this time. I guess, and for me, I guess the starting point for any of these things is a premise that I base my life on, and that is that the church, this church and any church, is God's church. It belongs to God. It's not my church. In a sense, it's not your church. I know we say this is my church. I know we all say that. Oh, this is my church. And because that's where you belong, right? It's where you belong. But this is God's church, because the day comes that you and I are not here. It's still God's church. So we're here to serve God's purposes through the life and ministry of the church. And we have to be mindful of what those purposes are, and how do we uniquely, with the gifts and abilities and skills and people and resources that we have, how do we do that? So that's always kind of a basic premise to start from, that this is God's church. And in every church, there's an inherent challenge that a lot of folks I've discovered, haven't really thought about. The church is a nonprofit organization. It's a 501c3, right? It's nonprofit. And in most nonprofits, they have to raise money to do the work that they do. And so you have a donor base that you work with to get the funds to do the work that you do, which generally are for the good of someone else. And so one of the interesting things is that while, yes, in the church we do ministry for people outside the church, absolutely, we also do ministry for people who are also the donors of the church. Have you ever thought about that? That it's this unique thing that we are here to serve, and we're here to serve the people who fund it, as well as people outside. It just creates an interesting challenge, because part of what can easily happen is to think about, well, I give my money here, I give my time here, I want to see things go the way I want them to go. Seen it played out many, many times, many, many ways. It's easy for that to happen in any church. So it's just one of those interesting challenges you have to always be mindful of. So as I think about those things, I think, so what are the messages that I want to do? The messages these few weeks will be practical about how to frame some things, about how do you ask better questions about the life of the church. And so I'll start with June 9th. June 9th, it'll be a message of hope, by the way. It's going to be a message of hope. That and as we talk that day about what it means to overcome obstacles. And there's always hope. You're always going to have obstacles. You're always going to have challenges. There are ways to face those. And so tremendous hope that we'll talk about that day. Next week, we'll talk about the ways that we communicate about things and how do we all participate. Because we're all in this together. It's not just one person. It's not the fortunes of a church don't rise and fall simply on who the pastor is. It's about everybody. This is our church, right? And today the title of the sermon, I don't know, maybe a little bit foreboding. I should have chosen a different title. But the title of the message is Cold Hard Facts. Now I know a shiver just went down the spine of some people in this room. Because typically we think of cold hard facts as bad news, right? When you're anticipating bad news, doctor, just give me the cold hard facts. You're talking to your tax accountant, just give me the cold hard facts, because we anticipate bad news. That's not exactly how I intend this. Many years ago, there was a researcher, writer, scholar named Jim Collins who wrote a bunch of books. One of them was Good to Great, and he talks about in that book, you have to look at cold, hard facts. And he doesn't mean it's necessarily bad news. He just means you got to have a clear view of the information. You just got to have a clear view. Instead of thinking what you wish it would be, what you hope it would be, what it could be, what's the real information of what's going on. And so maybe we tag cold hard facts, facts are our friends. Facts are our friends. Because you don't really know what to do going forward if you don't know the information. And sometimes that information is hard to know. There are times it's hard to know. And so there are some unique challenges that come along with that. But because sometimes we see things that create discomfort in us. They create discomfort. And I've used a saying before, and you've heard it elsewhere, but I really believe it to be true that since people don't like to change. That's one of the truisms of life, right? We don't like change. But the saying is that people will change when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of change. When staying the same is more painful than change. And so part of when you look at cold hard facts, sometimes you realize, yep, we got to do some things. And that's okay. That's a good thing because it means you're going to move forward. So this is not a doom and gloom series. Facts are our friends. And we're going to see how this plays out in the figure of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is an Old Testament figure that a lot of people don't know much about. A lot of people haven't read Nehemiah. You really get the story of Nehemiah in chapters 2 through 7. The other chapters are good and important, but you really get the story of Nehemiah, and that's where we're really going to focus, is that story that happens between chapters 2 and 7. And to see the principles that he put into place as he worked to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and how those principles apply to us also today. So Nehemiah, this Old Testament figure, there's a lot of history behind it. But I could start off with 30 to 40 minutes of giving the historical background every week. I don't see any takers on that. Well, I saw one. We'll talk after. So we're gonna look at Nehemiah in a sense as a parable. I mean, it's not just a parable. We're gonna look at it as a parable. Like Jesus would tell a story that connected to real life, but there was always a deeper meaning. There was more to the story. And so we're going to look at Nehemiah in a sense as a parable. So let me tell you a little bit about how Nehemiah got to be where he was, as you heard the scripture read a little bit ago. He's among the many people hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, among the Jews who, through all kinds of events, scattered and moved off to different lands. That could have been, the overthrow by the Assyrians who scattered the Jewish people. It could have been the overthrow of the Babylonians, and they scattered. Economic circumstances, whatever, that people fled Jerusalem, Judah, the area around Jerusalem, and Jerusalem, and went to different lands. I mean, this is not new, right? This is still happening today. That people in whatever land they live find living situations untenable. And they're finding another place. It's happening all over Africa. It's happening in Asia. It's happening in South America. I mean, now we call it immigration. It used to be people just moved because they could not stay where they were. That's still happening. So in that, so people moved all over the place. So Nehemiah, somewhere along the way, his people had moved to a place in Persia. And so he was the cupbearer to the king, who at that time was Artaxerxes. So here's a good example of someone from a Jewish background who was an observant Jew, but living in an alien culture. Was not his culture, different beliefs, all that. But he was a very trusted person. I mean, right? Because you know in ancient and medieval times, there were always attempts to poison the king because somebody else wanted to be king. And so it was a very, very trusted position, and he was around the king a lot. And so one day he's there to serve the king, and he's very, very sad. And the king even asked him, "Dude, are you sick?" I don't know if he said dude. But are you sick? And no, he's just very sad because he had heard that Jerusalem had fallen into disrepair. Jerusalem, the center of worship, the center of identity of God's people. But he had not been there in a long time and didn't know exactly what was going on. Well, his brother and some friends went. And they came back with the report that the once mighty gates had been burned, the walls had been destroyed, and what people were left were despondent. I mean, they were in a horrible, horrible living situation. And this made him very, very sad. And so the king noticed that, and so he asks, may I go back to see what I can do? Can anything be done? And the king gives him permission. So that's kind of the backstory to him going to look at Jerusalem. And you heard from the scripture that he circled the city, went around through the valley, went through the gate to assess. So we're going to talk about this. He saw a very difficult situation. He saw a very, very difficult situation. But he did not despair. What we're going to see on the third week is what was accomplished, and they were very clear to say, with God's help. I mean, one of the things we affirm in the Bible is all things are possible through God. With God's help, things could happen. So he's assessing the situation because of the discomfort that he has felt. And when you hear bad news like that, it does create some challenges, because none of us like bad news. None of us like bad news. One of the responses to bad news is denial. Oh, that can't be, right? It can't be that bad. Oh, that's not going to happen. It's just denial. Just, nope, not going to look at it. Not going to think about it. And we all know people. Surely, you've known people, I have, that, for example, knew something was wrong with them, but they wouldn't go to a doctor because they were afraid of the news. And so they kind of lived in denial that something might be wrong because we don't like the bad news. So denial is always a challenge. One of the challenges to bad news is nostalgia, because we remember when it was better. In the good old days. Wish we could go back. Right? You get bad news and you start thinking, oh, when it was better. And all that does is kind of cloud your view and your judgment of what's really going on. And you want to go back to those days. And when I hear people talk about the good old days, I mean, I always think, yeah, my grandparents had to drill a water well, and they didn't have electricity until they got a windmill with a generator on it. Lived out in the middle of the country during the Dust Bowl. Yeah, let's go back to the good old days. Sure, fine, right? It's selective. It's selective memory when we get nostalgic. And that can block us from seeing what's really going on. And I think another challenge is that we just ignore, we just ignore things. We just ignore it. You know, the head in the sand syndrome. I was at a meeting with pastors years ago, and at a break, some of us had gone to the soda machine to get a soft drink, and I was behind a guy that I knew had moved to a different church recently, and I said, hey, how's it going there? Oh, it's good. And I said, well, you know, what I've heard of that church is it's a good, strong church. It's a small community, but a good, strong church. And he said, yeah, there's really good people there. And then he said, our attendance has really gone down. I have no idea why. And he turns and gets his drink and goes back into the meeting room. And I wanted to grab him and say, dude, you don't know why? Are you not looking around? Are you not asking questions? That's all there is to it? I don't know why. Sometimes you need to ask some more questions. I did not grab him by the shoulders and shake him like I wanted to. I did not. Dude, I did call him dude. I did call him dude. Yeah, I did. That's true. So as I talk through this, you can see how there are, when you look at the life of the church and you want to look at facts and at the same time there's emotions tied up in this, it just becomes challenging. And so I'm going to offer a way to think about how you can assess what's going on at a church, and even if it creates discomfort, you begin to know what to do next. So I've played golf off and on through my adult life. I go through spurts. I play really regularly, and then I don't for years, and so I kind of back and forth. But somewhere along the way, someone gave me this advice. They said, when you're trying to figure out what to do for your next shot, think wild. Okay, say more. Say more about that. And they said, think wild. Think wind, incline, lie, and distance, in that order. So let me talk through that. So often when we get, if you play golf, I know some of you play golf, and even if you don't, I think you'll understand. You've teed off, your ball is wherever it is, and you get to your ball and you're trying to figure out, what do I need to do next? How do I need to hit this ball? What club do I use? And so often the first thing we think about is the distance. How far is it going to be? And so you might think in terms of church, how long is it going to take for that to happen? What's the distance here? Don't think of that first. Maybe the first thing to think about is the wind. What's the wind doing? Is it strong? Is it gusty? Is it light? What direction is it coming from? What's happening with the wind? Well, I've said in a previous sermon just recently that in the Old Testament languages, the word for wind is also the word for spirit, also the word for breath. What's the Spirit of God doing in the world around us? What do we see? What do we experience? How do we see God moving in the world? What wind is blowing that is not just about this church, but just what do we see? The thing is, there's other winds, because the culture you live in also has some wind to it. And you got to know what that is. So, for example, many decades ago now, there was this thing going on in the world called the Cold War. Some of you might remember the Cold War. We did not like those folks in the Soviet Union, and we referred to them often as godless communists, right? They were atheists. They were godless communists. And so in part, as a reaction to that, well, we're Christian, we're going to church. And so the culture pushed us toward church. The culture pushed us toward church. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it was different in those days. The culture pushed us toward church. I mean, on Sundays, there was not much else to do. Stores were closed. The ones that were open, there were certain items you could not purchase. Anybody ever run into that somewhere? Oh, yeah. I remember going to a grocery store one time when I was in college, and they were like, well, you can't buy that, you can't buy that. I'm like, why not? It's Sunday. Because you should be in church, right? The culture pushed us to church. The culture doesn't push us to church anymore. It doesn't happen anymore. To me, the wind of the culture is swirling, going all different directions. We have way more options anymore to do anything other than go to church. And so we are not pushed toward church. And so that just creates a situation we have to be aware of. For example, I know that people who have young kids at home, do I hear something? That's kind of fun. Little musical background. So, what was I saying? People have kids at home. often by the time they get to Sunday, they're completely exhausted. And they've still got to do laundry. They've still got to look at their bank balance. They've still got to take care of this. We still got to. And so Sunday becomes a day you do that. So the culture doesn't push us toward church anymore. As an example, you have to know what the wind is. Now, a second thing to look at is the incline. What's the incline happening? Is the ball on an incline? Are you hitting uphill, downhill? Uphill is that's a lot of work, right? Whatever the task is, this is going to be a lot of work. Sometimes you're lucky and you get a downhill, you're hitting downhill. So like, the thing we could sometimes say, the low-hanging fruit. What's the low-hanging fruit? The previous church I was at, I got there and honestly, I missed the turn the first time I went to visit. I was like not going to meet anybody. I just wanted to see it. So I drove there, and I'm driving by, and I literally missed the turn into the church parking lot because they had these giant cedar shrubs surrounding their parking lot. Now, I found out later those had been planted when the building was built as part of the original landscaping, but they had never been trimmed. Now, I don't know if you know about these big old juniper cedar shrubs, but they get huge. I mean, 10, 15 feet high and just gigantic. And so literally, because the church sat up higher than the street, and you literally could not see the church from the street. So as I get there, I just start asking questions about that. Tell me about those shrubs out there. Oh, we hate them. Okay, all right. And I said, so why are they there? Well, the HOA won't let us take them out. Well, HOAs, right? Anybody else live in an HOA? That's fun. Sorry, I'm not bitter about this at all. The HOA won't list. Well, okay, so I just asked the HOA. I said, hey, I'm new in town. I played the rookie card. I'm new. Could I get the bylaws and all that kind of thing? So I read them. Oh, there was nothing stopping us. Somehow the word had gotten out, you can't do that. Okay, well, no, we could do that. So I just talking to somebody, I said, well, we can take those out. But I know it's going to cost a lot of money. He said, I've got a chainsaw. He said, and I got a lot of friends with chainsaws. So we scheduled a couple of work days, Saturday work days. And in those 2 work days, there were about 25 people there, all of them with chainsaws, by the way. And I think it was 36 of those giant shrubs were taken out. And they were ecstatic. They had been saying for years, we hate that, we hate them, we hate them, we hate them. So, low-hanging fruit, right? Yeah, that was you're hitting downhill. This is easy. Hopefully you can find some of those, and you take advantage of those. Sometimes it's the other direction. You're going uphill, and it's not necessarily going to be easy. But that's part of life, right? So the incline. Third, the L. The lie. Where's the ball? What's the situation? Is the ball on grass? Is it on short grass? Is it in the deep rough? Is it in the sand trap? Is it on a bed of rocks? Is it on the cart path? Is it in mud? What's the ball lying on? You have to know that. So what are the immediate realities surrounding the church? What are the immediate realities? Well, many of you know that one of the immediate realities this church faces is that across America, downtown churches struggle. Downtown churches struggle. For all kinds of reasons. They just struggle. And I'm well aware, many of you have heard the news that Central United Methodist Church in downtown Phoenix voted to close. That has been, over its years, has been a large flagship church. But they reached a point where they were no longer sustainable, and they voted to close. That's not a unique story. So part of what we have to understand is one of the immediate realities is it's difficult being a downtown church. That's not a death sentence. That doesn't mean there is no hope. As a matter of fact, I would turn that around for this church and say, I think this church is uniquely positioned to do well in the future. But you can't ignore the reality. A lot of downtown churches are struggling. So you will have that current to push against. You'll have that reality. But I really believe this church has great hope. I really believe this church has a unique ministry in its location and can expand that ministry going forward. I believe this church is in a good place. And the last one, the D, is for distance. Now, let's talk about how far it is. How far do we have to go? How much work is this going to be? So one of the things in another church I experienced, and I'll just tell you some of these experiences I've had along the way that I think are maybe helpful and instructive. A church that had serious budget issues one time. It was around 2008. What happened in 2008? Oh yeah, recession. And so the trend of that church was that that church was spending more money than it was taking in. And so we figured out some corrective actions. But part of what we had to say was, it took us a while to get into this situation. It's not going to change overnight. There's a trend, and we have to change the trend and live into that trend. And so we estimated it would be 18 months before that would turn around to where we were back solvent and everything was okay. We were able to do it in less than that. But believe me, I had to remind people all the time, we're still going uphill. We're still going. It's a long way. We got to just keep going. We keep going. And that church ultimately got there. But you got to know sometimes it's just going to take longer than you want it to take. So, and every church has those issues that can be low-hanging fruit, can be dealt with quickly, and some not so much. So Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem, the center of worship, the center of identity of God's people at that time. Because he had heard the report, but he wanted to see it for himself. Yeah, it's always good to say, thanks for letting me know that, but I'm going to look deeper. So he goes to see for himself, and he does an assessment. And he even says, no one knew what I was looking at. No one knew what I was doing. I didn't talk to anybody. I was assessing. I was gaining information so that he would know what to do next, what's going to happen next. Now, spoiler alert, in the end, yes, they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. They did. And as they did that, they did it with a lot of participation. They did it with a plan. They did it overcoming obstacles. And in the end, they worshiped, saying, with God's help, we did this. I believe that can be true of any church. That when you look at the challenges and the difficulties, it can be done. As you band together, everybody participates, you have a plan, and you move forward, and with God's help, good things happen. I really believe that for this church. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about some of those things that I think will help this church moving forward. Now, to be sure, I'm not at all trying to set the agenda for the incoming pastor. I'm just trying to say, I think these are things that this church can do going forward. I do believe part of the great future of this church is the incoming pastor, the Reverend Dr. Sam Parks. He's happy for you to call him Pastor Sam. I think you're going to enjoy him a lot, and you'll know in the next couple of weeks, we'll be letting you know more about him in his time to come when he gets here on July 1. I truly believe in the good news of this church. I truly do. And I believe that you, together with God's help, will do great things. I invite you to pray with me. Well, God, we're grateful for all of your gifts. We're grateful for your blessing. We're grateful for your presence. We're grateful for your church that you have entrusted to us to be able to serve your purposes, to serve your people. For this to be a place that develops us into more faithful and fruitful disciples, but also a place that reaches out to others, that we become a helping station for those who pass by. We thank you for the ways that we have seen that exhibited throughout the Scripture and for the ways we have seen people be faithful and fruitful through those stories. We pray that you would help us to be that as well, and know that you always hold the future in your hands. So God, in all these things, we seek to be more and more like Christ, that we would live and love like Jesus, that we would follow his model, and that we would be his people in all things. You know, especially this is important as he taught his own disciples what that would look like. And he taught his disciples how to pray. And so we, like them, pray the prayer Jesus taught. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not to temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.